Today we are going to take a little bit of a deep dive into the Kenites. The Kenites? Who are the Kenites? The Kenites were a portion of the multitude. And during Exodus, there were a whole mess of Kenites amongst those thousands of people who Pharaoh finally said, "Get the hell out of here, you guys are too much trouble." Of course, he could have made it very easy on himself, but pharaohs don't make things easy on themselves. So let's kind of skip across the surface here just to make it abundantly clear to everybody that the Kenites were a real group of people and that they were significantly connected with our faith. Why? Well, because people need stuff. People need things to be made. People need craftsmen who take pride in their work. I know pride isn't a good thing, but you know what? I just made myself a very nice breakfast, and I can say that to you because it was a very nice breakfast. By anybody's reckoning that I've ever made breakfast for, I know how to make breakfast. So the Kenites knew how to make stuff too. They had a skill set. The Kenites are a group of people. Now understand that I'm taking some of this information from the first thing that AI will give me. Because remember, when you Google stuff, you're not dealing with human beings. You're dealing with a robot library, essentially. You're at the circulation desk and you say, "I want to know about the Kenites in the King James Bible." Okay. The Kenites are a group of people associated with Jethro. Not Jethro Bodine. No. This was Moses' father-in-law. Moses was married to a Kenite woman. How about that? That the Kenites were known for their metalworking skill and for their nomadic lifestyle. What's that tell us? Those of us that have looked into some of this before. Well, it tells us that the Kenites, very likely, right after the flood, were trying to jumpstart. The Kenites were trying to jumpstart what Cain had come up with before the flood. And what Cain came up with before the flood was disobedience for profit, basically. And maybe for fun and profit. Kenite means of Cain. Cainites. The Cainites are the Kenites. Okay? And you don't have to go too far down Cain's bloodline to find Lamech, the inventor of polygamy, right? As though one wife isn't enough. And the product of that first dalliance into polygamy produced 4 kids, each of them with the equivalent of an MBA back then, right? These were the children of a king and a queen of the dear leader, they might call him if this happened in North Korea, Cain. In fact, one of those kids of Lamech had Cain hyphenated onto his name, which brings me back to what I was saying a minute ago. These nomadic metal workers, it seems to me, have in their bloodline more than a little bit of Tubal-Cain and more than a little bit of Jabal, right? Jabal, the herder. Remember, ranching is a take the cattle where the food is kind of job, okay? And it's the monetizing of the kind of thing that Abel was doing as a shepherd for fun and profit. Okay? And so the Kenites that produced Jethro and his offspring, and hence dovetailed into the greater story leading to Jesus later on. Moses married into a brilliant family, a family that I'm not going to say they were moral. I'm not going to say they're good looking, but I will say that they were brilliant. Okay? They were brilliant in a Bill Gates kind of way. They were brilliant in a Elon Musk kind of way. They were brilliant in a Steve Jobs kind of way. They were brilliant in a Henry Ford kind of way. They were brilliant in an Oscar Mayer kind of way. These Kenites. Okay? And way back with Lamech's crew, they also invented pornography, pole dancing, and all of that stuff, okay? Which is basically the submission or domination of women for fun and profit. And the fourth kid, Jubal, was the one that was popping quarters into the jukebox so that people could dance while they sinned. Right? These four kids are kind of the progenitors of eat, drink, and be merry. Right? Eat, drink, and be merry until the flood washes you all away. Kenites. Kenites. The offspring of Cain. Okay, the garbage truck's gone down the street, so I can put this thing back down out here. Metalworking skills, nomadic lifestyle. Stay dialed in on that. And we find them mentioned in Genesis, Exodus, Judges, and 1 Samuel. And they are genetically linked through the Jabal Wrangler connection here. The Kenites are linked to the Rechabites, Rechabites, who have, AI never goes into it unless you really specifically ask. They also have a nomadic way of life, okay, pre-Bedouin, right? What's the Jethro connection with Moses? Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, is identified as a Kenite priest. A Kenite priest. Whatever Cain worshipped, this dude was a Kenite priest of Midian. They were very involved with the early Israelite experience, I'm just saying. The Kenites were known for their metalworking skills, particularly in copper and iron. Post-Stone Age, people. Right? Gold, silver, bronze, iron, and then dollar store iron with 10 toes. They lived in tents. They moved from place to place. Genesis 4:22. And AI would have us believe that the Kenites showed kindness to the Israelites during their journey out of Egypt. And it says here that Saul acknowledges this in 1 Samuel 15:16. Okay, we're gonna go a little deeper into that here shortly. Whether it was kindness or whether it was commerce. Okay? Some Kenites, including those related to Jethro, traveled with the Israelites to Canaan. 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 After the Exodus. I'm very certain that these Kenites were amongst the grumblers. Right? The grumblers. Not happy with the menu. A lot of Kenites got bit by snakes. And I dare say a bunch of Kenites probably got obliterated with the wrath of, when the wrath of God was like, no, it's definitely time, Moses, to go stop that silliness. Okay? It says they later settled in various parts of Judah and even the north near Kadesh. So, in the same way that the Samaritans were mixed blood with the Israelites, so too were the Kenites. Okay? And the Rechabites as well. Now, the Rechabites had a strict adherence to a nomadic lifestyle, and they refused to cultivate the land or drink wine. Okay, so you can imagine that a Kenite priest would be very anti people like Abel or Seth, for that matter, right? These shepherds, okay? Who obeyed God. These Rechabites didn't want to grow anything, and they were teetotalers. I don't know why. We'll need to look into those Rechabites in 1 Chronicles 2:55 and find out just exactly how that social connection happened. Okay? And one of my wife's favorite stories, and I like it too, of a Kenite is Jael, Jael. She killed Sisera, the commander of the Canaanite army. A Kenite woman took out the commander of the army in Canaan, which would have been an army that would be praying to the gods of Cain. But this Kenite woman, Jael, is the one who very famously got this rotten military idiot, the Pete Hegseth of his day, hammered, and then she drove a tent spike through his head, literally connected his head to the dirt with a giant tent peg, because God told her it's time for that dude to go and you're just a girl to do it. And she did. Judges 4:17-21. In Numbers 24:21-23, Balaam, remember Balaam's donkey? Balaam prophesies about the Kenites, noting their secure dwelling place and eventual destruction by the Assyrians. Okay, and if you want to know what kind of people the Assyrians were back then, look at the first three letters of their name. They were a real hassle, those guys, and real disobedient. And so, yeah, these Kenites, they're all over town, causing a fuss, just like Cain did, When in doubt, when backed in a corner, take out the foe. Now the Kenites, and this comes from both scriptural accounts as well as scholars that look at history, okay? There are those of us who've studied the historical Jesus. Where does he appear in texts written by people that didn't follow his teachings? They were just looking for accurately depicting what everybody else was up to, both in the Bible and in these secular histories. We find that the Kenites are generally understood to be the descendants of Cain. Okay? Some scholars link them to the Midianites, but that does not mean that they didn't come from Cain. Okay? Jethro, the Midianite, was also a Kenite priest of Midian. And their origin is primarily associated with the murderer of Abel, the first killer. Kenites derive from Cain, first son of Eve. The Bible mentions them in a lot of contexts, and they were in the presence. They were in the land promised to Abraham, as well as the land promised to Moses and the Israelites. They were already there. Land of the giants. Remember? My gosh. Joshua and Caleb. You know, they look at these things and they believe God. We can whoop them. Us plus God is a majority. But the majority of folks that went in, the majority of people that went in to scope out Canaan, all they could do is be afraid of the size. Listen to this. The size of the inhabitants of Canaan and their huge fortified cities. They seemed very dangerous to the godless. The Kenites were known as nomadic metallurgists, metal workers that walked from place to place. I remember when I was a kid, there was this old Italian man who had this bicycle attached to a knife sharpening apparatus that he would pedal the bike around neighborhoods, and there was a bell he would ring. And people recognized the sound of the bell. Understand that a bell is the product of metalwork too. And they would bring out their knives and hatchets and whatever they had that might need to be sharpened. And this gentleman, he was a craftsman. He knew what he was doing. Would make your kitchen knives as well as sharp tools very much sharper than they were before you gave them to him, right? He had a grinding wheel and other things with which he could sharpen knives, and that was his whole gig. And he'd pedal this thing around the neighborhood, ringing the bell, and people would bring stuff out, and it was super old school business. And in a way, he was a nomadic metallurgist. Okay? Ties back to Tubal-Cain and Jabal. Jabal, the nomadic rancher, and Tubal-Cain, the inventor of golf. They're all over Arabia. They're all over Canaan. They're all in Judah. So, in 1 Samuel 15:6, the Kenites are being addressed, these offspring of Cain. Go away. Leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them. Why? For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. How did the Kenites show kindness during Exodus? Well, if you think about the things that occurred during Exodus, you'll remember such things as the Ark of the Covenant, the staff with some kind of a snake, which seems to have been crafted out of metal attached to the top of it, which Moses used to show the wonders and power of God. When I think about various kinds of curtains that would hang around the tent tabernacle, curtains and so forth hanging on golden rings, anything that was made of metal, okay? Be it a washing bowl, a candelabra, a component of the ark, and I'm sure just basic things like metal tent pegs to keep the tents from blowing away in the wind. These things were made by Kenites, okay? And apparently there were a lot of slaves in Egypt besides the Hebrews that had been gathered up, kidnapped from wherever Egypt could go and snap them up. Okay? And you could imagine that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so the Kenites might have gotten along with the also enslaved Israelites simply because of the shared bondage that they were experiencing and the slavery, right? In 1 Chronicles 2:55, Kenites are mentioned again. It says, the families of the scribes. Okay, now remember, the scribes are sort of like the equivalent of government employees who document things and remind things that to people that have been written down in the past, okay? That's a scribe. They inscribe things, they write. The families of the scribes which dwelt at Jabez, and the families were the Tirathites, Shemaathites, and Sukkothites. These are the Kenites that came of Hamath, Hemath, father of the house of Rechab. You understand, of course, that this deep dive never ends. The Bible gets bigger every time you open it, right? Every time you open it, you find something that can be researched, which will literally add chapters of information to what you can find in Scripture. Numbers 24, 21 through 23, Balaam's sixth message. Balaam's a funny guy to read up on. God really exhausts a lot of wit to show Balaam and these crazy Kenites, you know, that believe what Cain believed. Then he saw the Kenites and spoke his message. This is Balaam talking. He's the one that wasn't able to curse the Israelites with his own mouth. He just couldn't do it, right? He wasn't permitted. But he can talk to the Kenites, and he said, your dwelling place is secure. Your nest is set in rock. Yet, that's like saying but, yet you Kenites will be destroyed when Assyria, takes you captive. Okay. Do we know a little bit more about the Kenites? Let's keep going with the nature of the Kenite.
Arthur, King of the Britons, your knights of the Round Table shall have a task to make them an example in these dark times.
Good idea, O Lord.
Of course it's a good idea.
All right. The Kenites first appear in the biblical narrative in Genesis 15:19, where they're listed among people whose land God promised to Abraham's descendants, right? Abraham, your descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky, the sand on the beach, and where they live is presently occupied by Kenites, Kenizzites, and Cadmonites. This establishes their presence in that region, the Holy Land, long before the Israelites ever got there, right? So this comports perfectly well, dovetails perfectly well with the testimonies of Joshua and Caleb when they came back out of their spy mission. Well-established cities in Canaan before the Israelites ever got there. And then we move to Exodus 3:1, and that's, of course, where we learn, as I said, that Jethro, a priest of Midian, it suggests he was a Kenite. Baloney. He was a priest of the Canaanite religion. He was not a priest of the one God. And it just goes to show that the Kenites were involved in the development of Israel as a nation. And you know, Moses' father-in-law is credited with giving Moses wise counsel, which is to say that anyone can be saved from delusion and stupidity and wrong belief. And if anybody was going to be affected by what Moses had to say, chances are it would have been a family member first. I think it's great that Jethro got the scales off his eyes once he saw what our God could do. It's recorded in Judges 1:16 during the conquest of Canaan that descendants of Moses' father-in-law Jethro, the Kenite priest, went up from the city of palms, like palm trees, with the people of Judah to live among the inhabitants of Judah in the Negev near Arad. This passage indicates their integration and coexistence with the Israelites. Now, when history records that two very, very different cultures, societies, and belief systems lived integrated and they coexisted, I don't look at the adjectives, okay? Because if they say that these people peacefully coexisted, I've generally lived in places where there was a peaceful coexistence between good and evil, and that doesn't make it a good situation. It just means that nobody's getting killed right now because of it. The Cainites, generally associated with metalworking on the go, all right? And that would have been a very highly valued skill back in those days. They sure know how to build a fortress, right? Their dwelling places are secure. They build on rocks rather than sand. But they're still going to be taken out by God. God can do all kinds of things with minerals, rocks, and metal, let me tell you. Now, their nomadic lifestyle, which I believe ties back to Jabal, child of Lamech, the original rancher. These people lived in tents and moved with their flocks and herds, okay? Well suited for the rugged terrain of the Sinai Peninsula and the Negev Desert. This mobility allowed them to maintain their independence and adapt to changing circumstances, right? When they didn't like where they were, they moved. They went somewhere else. It was not only their nature, it was how to survive when you're different. And the Cainites were different. And I'm presuming that many of them were, you know, big, weird looking. They were of mixed blood, okay? Because what I'm doing here is when I talk about post-flood activity, I'm talking about how there were Nephilim before and after the flood, okay? And there are all kinds of strange pelvis-oriented ways of trying to ascertain how that happened, okay? But the one that Ham's wife may possibly have been carrying had possibly been molested and was carrying the bastard offspring of who knows who. Certainly not Ham. Ham, Japheth, and Shem were also quite perfect in their generations, as perfect as someone can be, who's been following the God of Abraham all the way back to Adam and Seth. These Kenites were Nephilim, a lot of them. They had camels. They had the kind of animals that can move things, as did a lot of Native Americans, I should add. Okay? The Kenites mostly stayed out of trouble with the Israelites and got along with them. A lot of intermarriage. And in the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, we we can learn about that tent spike through the head that the Kenite woman jail did to that awful military leader, murderer. They even get a warning. Think about that. The Kenites were warned by Saul, to get away from those Amalekites, because we're going to take out the Amalekites. You just need to separate from them. Stop the mixing. And so what's the big takeaway with the Kenites? They had skill, they had wisdom when it came to their craft, and they were people with whom strategic alliances could be made. In the same way that a person who has never taken the oath that brings them into the Cainite belief system for business benefit, Kenites have long been pagans who make a lot of money. And sometimes you have to interact with individuals who are unsaved in order that God's will be accomplished. And the Kenites weren't the worst of the dark church, but they were all in and early on. Nimrod was a Kenite. Okay? When Cain went to the land of Nod, that was where the dawn of the Kenite people happened, where those first cities were built. They interact with key biblical figures, and Kenites are known for possessing things, purchasing things, and weeping as a society. Think about that. These are people who've gained the whole world and lost their souls as a form of religion. And here's a really interesting thing. This is fascinating. If your last name is Smith or something Smith, Cooper Smith, right? I had a college drawing professor, Benjamin Cooper Smith. Wonderful old Jewish man. Brilliant. And I learned how to utilize charcoal as a medium through him. The name Smith comes from the Kenites. Let me say that again. The name Smith comes from the Kenites. Remember Mr. Smith in The Matrix? Why? Because anybody who's a Cooper Smith, a Copper Smith, right? Works in a smithy. It's a place where ores are made into metals through refinement, and metals made into tools and weapons. These are the Smiths. It's a very, very old name. And these Kenites, the Smiths, were a tribe inhabiting the desert between southern Palestine and the mountains of Sinai. Okay? Jethro came out of this tribe. Jethro Smith was Moses' father. Think about that. He's called a Midianite, okay, which I believe is, I don't know. It may actually have been a racial slur. Who knows? Midianites and Kenites are the same genetic stock. They are. They may have come out of the same tribe. Wandering Smiths, gypsies and traveling tinkerers in the old Oriental world. They formed listen to this is the beginning of the lodge. They formed an important guild, a guild. This is a professional fraternal organization. in an age when the art of metallurgy was only known by a few people. They offered their skills to Israel in their journey out of Egypt into the wilderness. And you could bet when they got to the promised land, they needed some weapons. All right? They accompanied Israel in their march as far as Jericho. And we know the story of Jericho and the supernatural battle that occurred there, and the walls came down. I'm reminded of a song by a wonderful band led by a songwriter and guitar. Walls fell down. It's a really interesting song. The band The Call is really worth your ears. They were wonderful. I've played in a lot of praise bands and in worship services as a guitarist and singer in the past, and you know what? Nobody's ever said, hey, let's do that song by The Call about the walls of Jericho falling down. I would have said, I'm on that and I could sing it too. Great song. So, the Kenites stick with the Israelites as far as Jericho and perhaps helped out with that. And then they return to their old haunts. I love that expression. A place you used to hang out is your old haunt. Where maybe some of the spirits, the demon spirits after the flood, are what haunt the land of the Kenites and the Amalekites, right? In the desert south of Judah. They sustained afterwards peaceable relations with the Israelites once the Israelites settled into Canaan, as we learn in Judges and 1 Samuel. Now the Rechabites, more Kenites, these Rechabites, okay? You know, you can be a North Carolinian, you can be a New Yorker, you can be a Hoosier from Indiana, but you're still an American. You see how this works? Okay, there's little reasons why subgroups form within larger groups. Usually it's regional, or it has something to do with how you're earning your living, right? So these Kenites, the Rechabites, are in Canaan. And in the days of Jeremiah, look in Jeremiah 35:7-10, they're referred to as following their old nomadic habits. And this is when Saul said, hey, you need to get away from those Amalekites because it won't take them out. And Saul goes in and smites Amalek, a giant. And why did he do this? Why did he tell the Kenites, you don't need to be there when this happens. I'm giving you a heads up. Saul said, you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. Thus, God is not unrighteous to forget the kindnesses shown to his people, but they shall be remembered another day, at the farthest, in the great day. This would be the day of wrath, rapture, and tribulation. At that farthest, in the great day, they're going to get recompensed in the resurrection of the just. Throne judgment. That's in M. Henry's commentary. And the last time that Kenites are mentioned is in 1 Samuel 27. Okay? The prophet Balaam, seeing the Kenites from the heights of Moab, made a joke about their name, right? Because there's the Hebrew word ken, which means nest. Not Cain, ken. You can set a nest on a rock and a strong wind will still blow it off, right? It has no foundation. It may be sitting on a rock, but a strong wind can knock it off, okay? Yep, and because these craftsmen were so helpful during the Exodus, God remembers. Even though they're worthy of a good cosmic dope slap for a variety of reasons, God is not forgetful and remembers their kindness. And it says in Jeremiah that these Kenites continued to live in tents, practicing their ancient nomadic customs on a richly varied landscape, with smiling cornfields and hills clothed with oak and terebinth. The word Queni, which phonetically sounds like Cainite, right? In Aramaic means smith. And they may really actually have been a tribe of traveling metal workers, right? The gypsies of modern Europe, as well as the traveling tinkers or blacksmiths of the Middle Ages, okay? Because of the skills they had, people really needed to get along with these folks because they made things that were useful. And Josephus, the famous historian, says that later on they began to be called the Kenitides, or maybe it's the Kenitides. And he also calls them the race of the Shechemites. Shechem, okay? More of these regional variants on descendants of Cain, Kenite, okay? The next question that I'm looking into is, can we describe the skills and talents of Tubal-Cain, Naamah, Jabal, and Jubal, the offspring of Lamech and his two wives? Okay? Because when we're talking about the Kenites, we're talking about the descendants of Cain. Okay? The name tells you the origin. I wonder whether these names are listed in the order that they were born from oldest to youngest. I'm not sure, okay? I haven't found that yet. But the four children of Lamech truly invented business, okay? I don't know if there was coinage back then. I don't know what they were using as currency back then. as the barter system moved over to a sort of a proto-capitalist way of dealing with God's blessings and turning them into something people need in a different form. Okay? Because business perverts creation for profit. Okay? In the same way that a false preacher in a dark church will manipulate the Word of God. Okay? They'll manipulate the described order of things and how to interact with that God into something else that the people think they need. And it's going to lead them right to hell, because this stuff is all of the world, right? So what do we know about these guys? I'm going to just kind of consider that maybe we're hearing who they are in the order of their birth. So Lamech and one of his wives, his first wife, I'm guessing, maybe he didn't even have the second wife yet. 2 kids are born, Jabal and Jubal. Jabal was the father of those who dwell in tents, nomads, and have livestock. Okay? There's a man out in the western center of this country, and his name is Dwayne Noel. And he's got a great YouTube channel that's called Bible Tack Room. And this man is, in fact, a horseman, okay? He trains horses. He teaches people how to ride horses. He teaches people how to care for horses. He teaches people how to train with compassion and respect other living creatures, mostly horses, okay? Jabal created this industry, okay? If it's a food or work animal, it's a Jabal thing, okay? He pioneered and significantly developed nomadic animal husbandry and the practice of living in tents. You may remember that some of the followers of Christ were tent makers. It goes back to Jabal. He's the ancestor of those with a pastoral lifestyle. Okay? I know a lot of people that like progressive music, and some of them really like music that came out of Canterbury, the Canterbury area in England, right? Why? This music is called pastoral music. Pastoral music. When we think of pastoral things, we think of Lewis Carroll sitting beside a slow, cool, shady river, writing in a notebook with his back against a tree, and he can hear wildlife all around him. Pastoral, okay? My porch here is very pastoral in a way, right? My backyard is very nearly a pasture. I don't mow it that much. And we have pets and we feed them. Okay, this is all Jabal stuff, all right? He invented the meat industry. Okay, next time you make a bologna sandwich or fry up some bacon, Jabal, all right? Then the next child, change one letter, Jubal, Jubal, is described as the father of all those who play the lyre, meaning stringed instruments, and pipe, meaning wood or brass instruments. Probably brass, right? Because these were metal workers. Although I can't really think of a single musical instrument, including drums, that don't have some metal and some animal hide. Hey, Jabal, can I have some of that animal skin? I'm making some drums over here, okay? And you need various kinds of nails and so forth. Metal rings in order to attach drum heads, to the rest of the drum. You think about musical instruments, the lyre and the pipe. Imagine violins, guitars, English horns, oboes, trombones, sackbuts, all of that stuff. This is Jubal. He invented musical instruments and music itself. And there are some very, very, very old musical scores written down in non-Western ways, not with the kind of notes that kids in band learn, where this early music can be heard. You can hear these melodies played today. Music is music. So Jubal, all the way up and through MTV and all of these online music sharing services and stuff. This is Jubal, MTV, the Ed Sullivan Show, all that. Music for fun and profit. Then comes another son, the one who America and Scotland seem to worship so much, right? Because we like golf. Tubal Cain, Tubal. So they changed Jubal to Tubal and stick Cain on it so everybody remembers where all this comes from, the Kenites. Tubal Cain was a forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Okay? Vulcan, Hephaestus, all these various gods of the forge are ancestor worship of Tubal Cain. Okay, metalworking, the development of tools, swords, axes, spears, knives, and eventually this same kind of craftsmanship was making guns and tasers and handcuffs and all of these kinds of things that are made of metal. Tubal Cain, god of golf, the god of golf. According to the Free and Accepted Masons of Ohio, it says here in Google. Well, these three guys, by the way, I think Tubal Cain was the first child of the second wife. Along comes Naamah, finally, the fourth child, the sister of Tubal Cain. It says the Bible doesn't specify her profession or skills, right? But she's associated with music and portrayed as something of a singer or cymbal player, right? So she's tied in with Jubal. But I think of her as a pole dancer. I really do. A stripper, at best. She found a way to monetize being a woman in the context of the technologies of the day. I think she's the first madam or pimp, and she is really the mother of pornography in my mind, and that what we now call the Jezebel spirit was fully inhabiting her decision making. Okay? Mammon, profit. Jezebel wasn't even born yet. Okay? But lust was one of the original sins, and Naamah capitalized upon it. Tubal Cain started making things and selling them. And a lot of those things would allow you to either be violent or idle and do nothing. Okay? If you're not raising praises with music to the one God, you probably ought not even be blowing in that thing or strumming on that thing. It's going to count against you. Jubal. Remember, Lucifer was the praise leader in heaven. So Jubal is tapping into that and mammon, okay, for money. And look at Jubal, right? The first two children of Eve, one was a shepherd and one was a shepherd, a herdsman, and the other one was agricultural. Okay? You put those two things together, those two skills, and you pretty much get Jubal. Okay? Where it goes from hunting to animal husbandry, you see? So the animals aren't choosing their own mates and living in the wild, and you go hunt them on down for food and flesh and bone and so forth that you need. No, now we are going to build a fence and tell these animals with whom they will mate in order that we can get more of them. Mammon, right there. Okay, taking the natural behavior of animals and attaching numbers to it and profit. So Lamech's family, all 4 kids were about making a buck. They were all royalty. They were raised without want. Their educations were as much of an education as a person could attain back then, and people were smarter than us back then. So these were very smart people, but they were greedy, they were self-righteous, they were prideful, and the things they were doing were certainly not things that the God of heaven would have them doing the way they were doing it. Right now I'm taking a look at a page called Faith in Learning, talking about the 3 brothers there, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and grab a screenshot of this because I like the images. Here we go. Where we can see axes. Oh, and of course hoes and other kinds of agricultural digging implements. Yep. Ada, Lamech's wife, gave birth to Jabal and Jubal, and the second wife, Zillah, gave birth to Tubal Cain and the sister Naamah. Okay, thank you for that confirmation. It says that agriculture and the nomadic life, music, metalwork, the traditional arts, these 3 men, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal Cain, are the first named creators in the Old Testament record. And they give a minuscule glimpse of how the createdness of God's beloved creation in turn generated creators. Okay? Early testimonies to God's creative power at work in people. You know, and for many years, as an artist and musician, I bump up against people that don't really understand what other people are creating and don't really have much interest in knowing much about it. That's okay. Everybody's life is busy. Everybody's got their front burner issues. This author says, I'm concerned sometimes that we take the meaning of creativity and somehow mangle it beyond use. So we end up assigning it to the decorative arts and maybe design only. Ken Robinson's useful definition of creativity is this: the process of having original ideas that have value. But it only takes us so far and runs into the bulkhead of originality. This latter is greatly overestimated by those who are only really seeking a kind of competitive advantage for their creativity. This search for originality for its own sake has led us into some strange paths, as any visit to a design museum or modern art installation will from time to time reveal. Jubal, Jabal, and Tubal Cain, I am positive, were not branching out as original artists. They were giving creative, and I might add commercial, expression to the crafts that they required in order to live, and in so doing created a culture. Okay? Somebody somewhere took the creative impulse that started in Eden and built human cultures with it. Why? Because they were created and were image bearers of their creator. How about that? Now listen to a quote from John Ruskin. Quality is never an accident. It's always the result of high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution. It represents the wise choice of many alternatives. This man lived from 1819 to 1900, but I agree. Notice that John Ruskin's definition of quality, okay, takes no moral stance. And by that I mean that a person can have high intentions, apply sincere effort, and skillfully and intelligently execute something and still be completely evil about it. Still be completely self-righteous about it. You can create something of quality like an EpiPen that saves people from allergic reactions. You can sell it to someone else who continues to make a quality EpiPen through high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution. But that person may price the EpiPen at a new price that makes it inaccessible to those who need it. The quality goes in, marches on. The profit margin marches on. Building barns, gaining the whole world with one's craft is a fool's errand.